test performance appear an indirect relationship to what is being assessed. Test users are not interested in test performance and test score, but in what test score mean the inferences that can be brought from them and what decision they can make with the score. And the second one is specific general purpose contrast. Look at the figure 17.4, specific purpose and general purpose. Specific purpose is the types of purpose test contrast underlying a specific. And the general purpose is extended to assess language without reference to a particular context of language use. For example, in the specific purpose, OET is mean occupational English test, and an example of general purpose like the vocabulary level test. And the last one, I would like to talk about the contrast, perplexity, and specificity. Look at the figure. It will talk about dimensions defining the options for contrast definition. As you know, specific purpose contrast and performance types contrast may be a natural match, while general purpose contrast naturally go with ability contrast. An example of tests of specific purpose abilities like can speak. It means a test that requires examining to perform tests that use the lexical grammatical construction from chemistry in order to test ability to speak about chemistry. And an example of a general performance test would be the oral proficiency interview of the American Councils on the teaching of foreign languages, because it requires them to engage in conversation about themselves and family that might come up in a social situation. And contrast theory is slippery conceptual business, but the most impact on rethinking contrast definition is the use of technology for developing test methods. According to Pacman, the new task formats and models of presentation that multimedia may require to redefine the very contrast we believe we are assessing. For example, the score interpretation for a test of writing, which requires learners to compose their response at the keyboard, needs to include the contrast of composing at the keyboard. And thank you for your attention. So Ms. Phụng will continue.
In my presentation, I would like to talk about the 5 subtypes of assessment. It is test methods, validity, test analysis, language assessment, and language teaching. And the last one, watchback. Let's take a look at test methods. The test methods are considered as systematic procedures set out for collecting information and making judgments for a particular assessment event. For example, the proficiency test such as TOEFL IELTS test, diagnostic test, it means to measure the learner's strength and weakness. Achievement test, for example. And secondly, many applied linguists consider that test methods are the set of procedures and describe them as set of characteristics rather than by cover-all terms, such as multiple choice. Why? Because a multiple choice only refers to one characteristic of the test. But in any given testing event, it is composed of a number of other factors which should be expected to affect learners' performance. Look at the summary of prediction and results. We can see that the scores are completely different among beginning, intermediate, and advanced. And we can give conclusions that the test performance would be free from any outside influence. However, test methods do affect test performance in various ways. There are two encompassing stages for describing test method. The first one, test method process. Let me clarify the process. The process means manufactures in a particular part of a specific test. And the second one, test task characteristic, including physical specifications of the room and the participants, the testing rubrics, the input to the test taker, the output expected from the learners. In addition, according to Bashman 1990, there are 5 factors related directly to the test methods and test task characteristic. Let's move on to the validation. There are 3 kinds of validation. The first one, content validity. The content validity consider whether the content of the test questions is appropriate. And criterion-related validity consider whether other tests measuring similar linguistic abilities correlated with the test in questions. And the last one, construct validity. It considers whether research shows that the test measures the construct discussed above. To sum up, validity is a property of the score interpretation rather than the test itself. And take a look at this. We can see that the test taker performance is including many factors such as the testing method, the interpretation of test task or method, and the goals and plans for participants, and even the using language ability of the learners. Let's move on to test analysis. There are 2 phases we need to clarify. The first one, item difficulty. The item difficulty is the percentage of examinees who answer the item correctly. And to obtain this percentage, the researchers divided the number who scored correctly by the total number who took the test and multiplied by 100. Secondly, correlation. Correlation is used to express the observation that the students score approximately the same on the 2 tests. A correlation can range from 1 to -1, indicating a perfect positive or negative relationship. And the last one, correlation of 0, would indicate no relationship. And there is an example. Look at the first table. We can see that the score between 2 tests are acceptable. It means the correlation is relevant. In contrast, the second table shows that the test score between 2 tests are irrelevant, and we can consider that there is a negative relationship between the test score. Now let's move on language assessment and language teaching. The relationship between assessment and teaching are multifaceted as the context and purposes of the assessment, and an increased interest in social and political influence on assessment. For example, traditional assessment only focus on summative assessment. It means just focus on the grammar or on the writing of the learner. But in new curriculum, assessment focus on the product of the learner. It means focus on the communicative language ability. And the pressure is increasing to demonstrate accountability and measurable outcomes are using assessment as a policy tool. The last but not least, I would like to talk about the washback. According to many applied linguists, the washback refers to the influence of language testing on teaching and learning. A washback is positive, meaning it can be brought about through the introduction of tasks that target the skill needed by language learner in real life and real situations. And the last one, washback patterns can change over time and the impact of the test is not stable. It means changing all the time. Let's take a look at the framework. And we can see that there is a close relationship between the washback effect to the outcome-based education. That is the end of my presentation. Let's move on.
The presentation, I will present 4 main ideas in my presentation part. First, the definition of alternative assessment. Secondly, its advantages and disadvantages. Thirdly, the outcome-based assessment. And finally, we have language assessment literacy. So let's begin with the definition of alternative assessment. Alternative assessment directly reflects the learning activities. This is the definition in the textbook by Brown and Hussins. However, I still think it is a little bit confusing for some of you, so I have found out the comparison. Sorry, not I found out, but Brown 2004 have stated the comparison between traditional assessment and alternative assessment, which can make some of you more understand about it. Alternative assessment is a long-term assessment rather than using only one shot or standardized exams in the traditional way. And it has a free response format in a communicative task, and it requires the teacher to give individualized feedback and washback. And it is also based on criterion reference scores. These scores are used to classify the learners according to whether they are able to complete a task or not. However, in the traditional way, traditional assessment is based on non-reference score, which means a student performance will be compared to that of other learner in class. And other kinds of information in the table, I think that they are quite familiar with us because we have met the information in the language, in the subject of testing. So we will move on to the how can we conduct alternative assessment in our classroom. First, we can make some observation. So how can we observe our student? We can use anecdotal records. They are like short story. The teacher narrated what happened in the classroom, and to report to the parents, to report to the school administrator. And the teachers can also use a checklist to observe the student. It can also be in the form of self-assessment, involves the learner making judgments about their learning abilities, about the achievement of the learning goals and objectives. It can be also in the form of portfolio. I think that the use of portfolio is more and more increasing in the aspect of language teaching. Portfolio is a purposeful collection of student works, and the purpose of using a portfolio is to create more opportunities for students to observe his or her progress first, and then the teacher. So we have 3 main kinds of portfolios. Showcase portfolio consists of a collection of the student's best work, which means the student has the complete freedom to choose his favorite or his best work to put into the portfolio. And the process portfolio needs to convey the work in progress. And finally, we have assessment portfolio, which is the most formal one, because this will help the teacher to provide learning evidence to the parents, to the school administrator. And of course, the teachers can freely to use the combination of these 3 in order to have a better assessment in classroom. And there are some other forms such as journals, project work, teacher-developed tasks, simulation, and peer assessment, which can be used at alternative assessment. So what are the advantages and disadvantages when the teacher apply alternative assessment in classroom? First, it can improve the communication between the teacher and student. As I have said from the beginning, alternative assessment can be mainly in the form of communicative tasks, and it requires the teacher to give feedback so that the teacher and the student can have more opportunities to communicate, to interact with each other, rather than just the standardized exam with the fixed answer key, with the fixed format. And next, alternative assessment can motivate the learners or develop their learning autonomy, because alternative assessment usually communicative tasks with open-ended and creative answer, which means the student has more freedom and they will feel a sense of responsibility, a sense of ownership of their own learning, rather than just learning by heart everything the teacher taught in classroom. And alternative assessment can also help teachers to develop their professional development. Why? Why it can help the teachers to develop their professional development? Because the use of various forms in alternative assessment enable teachers to have a wide range of learners' language performance in many different contexts, so that it can surely widen the teacher knowledge. And next, it will provide more valid and dependable evidence. We combine many different methods when we applying alternative assessment, which means we will have many different kinds of evidence to prove their learning process. And finally, alternative assessment can release learner on a level. I think alternative assessment creates a non-threatening learning environment for the student, which they can learn in a comfortable environment. They would because they can give open-ended and creative answer, and then receive feedback from the teacher in some kinds of communicative tasks without feeling the pressure. And how about the disadvantages? People may doubt the validity and reliabilities, because when we don't use standardized exams, we use portfolios, we use observation. These form may a little bit subjective. So the teacher role is to interpret them. So it may raise doubt about the validity and reliability of the interpretations. And next, their administrative feasibility and the cost effectiveness, because we have to combine a lot of forms when we conducting alternative assessment, so the teachers may be expected to take a lot of responsibility, and when we conduct such a lot of activities, it may be cost effective, which make us care a lot about the cost effectiveness. And finally, with such a lot of responsibility, whether the teachers are prepared, are trained to have enough knowledge to take on such a huge responsibility like that. And so next we will move on with the outcome-based assessment. Outcome-based assessment is used to report the student learning outcomes against pre-specified attainment standard, like framework, benchmark, band scale, and competencies. I think these terms are quite familiar with us. When we hear the word framework, the first thing we can think about is CEFR. Yes, Common European Framework of Reference. But do you know any other kinds of framework? Surely there are other kinds. And the first I want to introduce is a Canadian language benchmarks. And we also have the Australian Core Skill Framework Performance Indicator. It All these frameworks are kinds of outcome-based assessment. We will assess the student based on a pre-specified framework or benchmark. And finally, I will talk about the language assessment literacy, or LAL. Actually, literacy has its root from the adjective literate, which means we have the knowledge, we have the understanding about that aspect. So in order to be literate in terms of language assessment, means that you have knowledge of good practice in language assessment. So what do you need to know in order to be good at language assessment? According to Taylor 2013, there are 8 aspects in order for you to know, in order for you to understand about the language assessment. First, knowledge of theory. When you conduct an activity in order to assess students, you need to know the theory underlying it related to the subject language testing or language assessment. Number 2, technical skill. You need to know to use the software, the program that assists your process of assessment. Number 3, principle and concepts. Number 4, language pedagogy. Of course, you are a teacher and you need to know something like about teaching methodology. Number 5, social cultural values, the connection between the society and the cultural. Number 6, you are teaching in a Vietnamese environment or you are teaching in a bilingual environment. You need to know their own practices. And number 7, personal belief or attitude. What you strongly believe will lead to what you really do. So your personal belief will somehow affect the process of language assessment. Number 8, score and decision making, how to interpret the score, how you make that decision or something like that. And I also find out another College of Language Assessment Literacy by Davies 2008. He divided the language assessment literacy into 3 dimensions: knowledge, skill, and principles. Because actually the language assessment literacy doesn't have a fixed definition. A lot of definitions have been proposed recently and there is still a lot of discussion about it. But I think these 2 figures that I show you are somehow related to each other, similar to each other, such as the communicative language testing, the technological technological skill training or something like that. They are somehow similar in some aspect. And that's all for our group presentation. Thanks a lot for listening and please feel free to ask questions.